Welcome, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Mandate with MaShani Allen. So glad to have you all on today. I apologize for the last few weeks, but I was taking some much needed vacation and now I am back. So I know for the most part, since I've started doing these teachings, I have been teaching on who is Jesus. And we have learned that he is the epitome of humility. He is love, but I've been on who for quite some time. And I said that the way I would do these teachings is from a journalistic approach of the who, what, where, when, why, and how. So probably for the next month or next 4 plus maybe 5 teachings, we will be talking about what. And you all know me and Webster are best friends. So the word what actually means expressing inquiry about the identity, nature, or value of an object or matter. It's also used as an interrogative expressing inquiry about the character, nature, occupation, position, or role of a person. And the way I'm going to incorporate what with this teaching is a few years ago, well, it's been more than a few years ago, probably. I think that this might have been in the 90s, early 2000s. I might be dating myself. But there was this whole thing about WWJD, like what would Jesus do? It was t-shirts, it was wristbands, and it kind of, in some ways, calls people to be aware of Jesus. And I think it kind of was purpose to make or to cause people to consider Jesus in the different actions that they were taking. And the WWJD stood for what would Jesus do? And for me, I kind of always found that to be a bit disturbing because it's kind of hard to know what would Jesus do if you didn't know what did Jesus do. Like, what did he do? You can't try and figure out what he would if you didn't know what he did. So what we're going to talk about over the next couple of weeks is what did Jesus do? Not what would. No, what did he do? And as I was thinking about this, there's so many different directions that I can go, but tonight we're going to deal with a 3-letter word that seems so simple, but yet and still is so weighty. And I think it's important, especially since we are to be image and likeness. You know, we are supposed to be representations of Jesus and God in the earth. So it would be good to know what he did. What did he do when he walked the earth? And tonight we're going to talk about how Jesus, and I consider this to be extremely important, Jesus was able to see humanity. He saw people. And I think that that's important because looking and seeing is not the same thing. You can look at people all day, but that doesn't mean you see them. And I ended up doing like through Bible Gateway, just typing up Jesus see, Jesus saw. And it was so many verses that showed Jesus seeing or Jesus saw people. So we're going to go through a few of them today, but let me just share this with you. When Jesus would see people or when he saw people, he saw the whole person. He didn't just see the situation. He didn't just see the circumstance. When he looked at people, he saw the totality of who they were, not just possibly a decision that they made or a circumstance that they were in. And when I think about that responsibility that we have as believers, a lot of times when we see people, we only see that circumstance. We only see that sin. We only see that struggle. We only see, and you can fill that in however you want, but we really want to be able to see people through the Holy Spirit, how he sees people. And that takes more that takes more. And I think that sadly in humanity, we can just become lazy, and we just can be very, we can not be observant, and we can just assume things. But Jesus was always, always, always intentional. And I'm not saying we're going to get it right every time, but the purpose of my Bible studies is to provoke thought, which I believe once you can provoke thought, you can provoke change. And that's the main thing. And that change needs to be more Christ-like, not technically based on everything that we may have heard, but technically based on what the word says and what the word reflects about the one we are to reflect. So I looked up in the Hebrew what the word see actually means. It means to perceive with the eyes. It means to perceive by any of the senses. It means to perceive, notice, discern, and discover. It also means to turn the eyes, the mind, the attention to anything. See means to pay attention, observe. It also means to ascertain what must be done about it. You might want to highlight that one, because we're going to see that Jesus saw this way a lot in ascertaining what must be done about it. To see means to inspect, to examine. It means to behold. It means to experience any state or condition. To know of anything. It means to get knowledge of, to understand and perceive, to be skilled in. So those are just from the, oh, this is the last one, and this is important. And I believe that this is another part of seeing that Jesus displayed so beautifully for us that we can begin to do as well. This definition of see, again, this is the Hebrew definition of the word. It means to have regard for one, to cherish, pay attention to. So that's a whole lot for a 3-letter word that we can just use and not really even consider what it really means, first of all, and the type of impact that it can have. And I have had conversations with people who have shared how, they've talked to people, but the people didn't see them. And that sounds strange because that they may have been looking at somebody face to face. But again, looking and seeing is not the same thing. Now, the first verses that I want us to look at, sorry, I meant to do something and I didn't. Give me one moment. The first verses that I want us to look at is found in John 1, verse 46 through 48. John 1, 46 through 48. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, Jesus has been picking out disciples all day. He done been calling people out of boats and away from their father, and he just been finding his people. But this is an interesting passage. So John 1, 46 through 48 says this. So let me give a little more history. Well, actually, let me just pull it up right here. So what actually happened was there was one particular person that Jesus was getting ready to call out, but someone actually was telling him about Jesus before Jesus even called for him. And that's kind of how this passage gets started. Let me start with 45. First, John chapter 1, verse 40. Let's see. Okay, we'll start at verse 44. Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, of the same city as Andrew and Peter. Philip sought and found Nathanael and told him, we have, and again, y'all know the Amplified version is my favorite, so it has a little bit more words, but that's the version I'm reading from. Philip sought and found Nathanael and told him, we have discovered the one Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote about, Jesus from Nazareth, the legal son of Joseph. Nathanael answered him, Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip replied, come and see. Verse 47. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said concerning him, see, here is an Israelite indeed, a true descendant of Jacob, in whom there is no guile, no deceit, nor falsehood, nor duplicity. Nathanael said to Jesus, how do you know me? How is it that you know these things about me? Jesus answered him, before Philip called you, when you were still under the fig tree, I saw you. That verse right there could actually bless a whole lot of people, because we can think that we're invisible. We can think that because of circumstances and situations, that we are invisible to God. But Nathanael, what I want to point out, two things, well, more than two things. There's a few things that I want to point out with this verse. I probably shouldn't have read it all the way through and went point by point, but we'll get through it. First of all, when Nathanael is introduced to the fact that Philip is saying they found Jesus, his first response was one of skepticism. It was like, can anything good come out of Nazareth? He was skeptical about the person that he was about to meet. And when I was reading this passage, I found it interesting that even though Nathanael was skeptical, his skepticism did not stop Jesus from speaking truth about who he was, from going past looking at him to seeing who he really is on the inside and speaking that out loud for others to hear and for him to hear as well. And I started to think about, as believers, how do we respond when skepticism meets us first? Are we still able to see? Are we still able to say what we saw? Or do we allow the skepticism of another person or to cause us not to be the voice or the mouthpiece that we should be in that moment or in that situation? I just found that to be interesting, that Jesus did not allow skepticism to be a stop sign for him. And in the world that we live in right now with this whole cancel culture, the minute people say something, we want to make sure that we're not quick to cancel them out. We're not quick to not speak truth just because they may be skeptical. Because at the end of the day, even though Nathanael had skepticism, he was skeptical when he heard of Jesus, he still became a follower. And we just want to make sure that we don't allow a momentary thought process to limit us from being who we are supposed to be to people and speaking what we're supposed to speak to people, and and not allowing what we see to be shifted or tainted based on what they may have said. Because it's interesting, he like, can anything good? And the first thing, Jesus got to say about him is, here's a man in whom there is no guile. Like, some of us might have held that. Because we might have felt that, what he said was a little salty. So how am I say he ain't got no guile in him? How am I say he a person of good character when he a little salty? Here's a little sharp with what he had to say, about me. So we have that to me says something about the power of really be not just looking at people, but seeing. people. And one thing what did Jesus do? He saw people. The next verse I want us to look at, and this is a familiar passage, it's John chapter 5. And I'm going to read it, and then we're going to break this one down too. It says, later there was a Jewish festival feast for which Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem a pool near the sheep gate. This pool in the Hebrew is called Bethsaida. Yeah, having five porches. In these lay a great number of sick folk. What version is this that I'm reading? This must be the Voice. Let me go to my regular version, and then I'll get back to the Voice. We'll go to John chapter 5. Good thing I got my Bible with me. Oh no, this ain't the Voice. That is the Amplified version. It just got a whole lot of extra words. Okay, let me get back to this. Verse 3. In these lay a great number of sick folk, some blind, some crippled, and some paralyzed, shriveled up, waiting for the bubbling of the water. Verse 4. For an angel of the Lord went down at appointed seasons into the pool and moved and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring of the water, stepped in, was cured of whatever disease with which he was afflicted. There was a certain man there who had suffered with a deep-seated and lingering disorder for 38 years. The New King James Version says, when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, do you want to be made well? The invalid answered, sir, I have nobody when the water is moving to put me into the pool, but while I'm trying to come up into it myself, somebody else steps down ahead of me. Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your bed, your sleeping pad, and walk. Now, if you remember, one of the last definitions that I gave regarding, one of the definitions that I gave that I said you might want to hold on to was to ascertain what must be done about it. So here we have a man who has been at this pool all these years and been waiting on a healing. But he's been waiting on a healing via people. But Jesus saw him. Jesus saw him in his condition, and Jesus was able to ascertain what needed to be done. The man needed to be healed without the assistance of others. He just needed a word from God, i.e. Jesus himself. And when he got that word, he responded. But the thing was, Jesus did not ignore him. And it caused me to think, how many people do we walk by that have an illness, or they have a circumstance or situation that they have been in for a long time? Do we just look at them in that situation, or do we actually see them in that situation? Do we try to ascertain what can be done for them in that situation? The other definition of C that I told you to pay attention to, it said to have regard, to cherish, and to pay attention to. I think that we live in a life of so much hustle and bustle. Sometimes we don't pay attention to people the way that we should. And I'm not saying everybody is your charge. I'm not saying that at all. But I think that there's because Jesus didn't respond to everybody either. He responded to a whole lot of people, and we don't even know all the people he responded to because they said it's not enough books to be able to write down all the miracles that he performed. So we do know that he responded to a whole lot of people, but he didn't respond to everybody. So I'm not telling you to do that. But what I am saying is when you feel a circumstance or a situation is to be more than something that you look at, and it needs to be something that you see. Please be sensitive to be able, with the Holy Spirit, to ascertain what must be done about that situation. And I've just shown you how Jesus saw a follower from a distance, but now you see where Jesus is seeing someone in a bad state, a bad situation, been sick forever, but he was still able to be seen by Jesus. And sometimes when we have been in situations for so long, we can feel as though there's no way he will see us because it's been so many years. This text right here is a testimony that time does not mean that you're forgotten, and time does not mean that you were overlooked. In that moment when it was ordained for him to be seen by God, guess what? Jesus saw him. Now, this last passage that I want us to look at is, evidently everything is in the book of John. It's John 8. And let me just go to my Bible because I want to make sure I got the version I want in front of me. Okay. And again, a very familiar passage, but I want us to see possibly something a little different here. Verse 1. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now, early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had sat her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now, Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Then those who heard it began being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has none of them condemned you? She said, No, no one, Lord. And Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. So in one version of this passage, it says when Jesus saw her, when he saw the woman, that she didn't have any, he asked if she had any accusers. So I find it interesting. And I think that this is something we should pay attention to. When he saw Nathanael, that didn't take place in church. When he saw the man at the pool of Bethesda, that didn't take place in church. Now, this particular passage takes place in church, but it's not based on, it's based on people trying to use a situation wrongly that worked against them and worked on behalf of the woman. But I say that to say, regardless of where you are, church, pool, under a tree, you can be seen by God. You know, sometimes people feel as though they have to go to particular places for God's eyes to be open. Listen, his eyes is always open. So places don't necessarily make it to where you will now be able to be seen by him. But also for us, this is important because we can't only want our spiritual senses to work for us when we in church. They need to work whether we at a pool, whether we walking by trees, whether we in church or we outside of church. We need to be sensitive to not just look, but be able to see. What I love is this shows you Jesus can see people everywhere, and he can see people in all types of situations. You have one person, when he saw this person had skepticism. You have another person, when he saw this person had sickness and illness. Then you have another person, a woman at that, when he saw her, she was being accused of being adulterous, and she was caught up in controversy. And I think that that's important as well, because sometimes we feel as though some people will never be seen by God because of the life they live or the decisions they make. These scriptures right here prove that none of that stops people from being able to be seen by God, and none of that should stop us from being able to see people. Circumstances don't have to be perfect for people to be able to be seen. We just need to be sensitive and go beyond looking and being those who see. The other thing I want to say that I believe that these verses reflect is that Jesus wasn't biased. He wasn't sight biased. I know that ain't a real term, but just how people can be color biased, you can be sight biased, like you picking and choosing who you see, who you look at versus who you see. As believers, that's not something we're not supposed to pick and choose. That's not fair, and that's not right. Jesus, if you type it up, I'm telling you, if you type up see or saw, Jesus, you will see he saw crowds, he saw faith. There's a lot of things that he saw. And if he could have that type of sight, guess what? As believers, we should have that type of sight as well, but we need to know what to do with that sight. Again, we're supposed to be representatives. We're supposed to be image and likeness. Jesus was not biased. We should not be biased. We should be those who go beyond looking to seeing, regardless of a person's background, belief system, status. None of those things should hinder, block, or stop us from being able to see the whole person. And if those things have been, you might want to have a prayer chat. You might want to do a Dear God letter and be like, God, help me to see purely. Help me to see unbiasedly. Help me to see without judgment. Help me to see how you see. Because what did Jesus do? He saw, and he saw purely. I pray that you all are blessed by this message, and I will see you next week.